Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Not So Free to Contract, the flawed notion that employees and employers have equal power undermines workers' legal protection. Thank you so much for joining this crucial discussion. My name is Heidi Scherholz. I'm the president of the Economic Policy Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that uses the tools of economics to advance reforms that serve working people, deliver racial justice, and help guarantee gender equity. You can watch a recording of this webinar and check out our work at epi.org. This webinar is the final event of EPI's 3-year-long project on unequal bargaining power. This initiative was the brainchild of and shepherded by former EPI President Larry Michel. It has highlighted the need to center workplace power in our fight for broadly shared growth, for racial and gender equity, for workplace protections, and for a robust democracy. And we will put a link to the project website in the chat. Today's webinar profiles the recently released Not So Free to Contract volume published by the Journal of Law and Political Economy. We will put a link to the whole volume and to the introduction to the volume in the chat. This research unmasks the flawed neoliberal economics embedded in employment law and provides evidence that employers have pervasive power over employees in workplace, that it is not easy for an employee to quit as it is for an employer to replace a worker, and that restraining management prerogatives through labor standards and collective bargaining does not cause adverse economic outcomes. I would like to give a huge thank you to all the authors who have contributed to this volume and to the project, to the Journal of Law and Political Economy for publishing the volume and co-sponsoring this webinar, and to the project's funders, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and the Bernard and Ann Spitzer Charitable Trust. And a huge thanks to Larry Michel for conceiving and overseeing the Unequal Bargaining Power Initiative and editing and contributing to the volume. And it is my great pleasure to now introduce the moderator for today's session, Gretchen Rogers, professor of law at Georgetown University and the author of the forthcoming book, Data and Democracy at Work, Advanced Information Technologies, Labor Law, and the New Working Class. Gretchen, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I'm really happy to be here and so excited that the papers from this project have now been published. I think they can really reshape how policymakers, economists, and legal scholars understand the labor market, and I do think they'll have a substantial impact. My job here right now is pretty brief. I want to just introduce the speakers in a moment, but before I do that, I thought I'd make a couple very quick observations about the relevance of the research. The first is that I 100% agree with the baseline assumption of the project. And, I teach labor law and employment law, namely that we don't have to look very far in legal and policy debates today to find this assumption of unequal bargaining power. I think Larry will talk about Justice Gorsuch's suggestion in Epic Systems that workers essentially choose to sign class action waivers in arbitration rather than being required to do so. I'll give one other observation, which is that in debates around whether gig economy workers should be treated as legal employees with, benefits like minimum wage and protections against discrimination and workers' compensation, the gig economy companies have repeatedly asserted that workers choose the, flexibility and opportunity that come with independent contractor status, rather than being required to waive their rights, waive many of their employment rights as a condition of working for Uber or DoorDash or whatever it is. And state agencies have often agreed with that, just disregarding the economic pressures facing those workers. One other point I'll make is that there's a kind of a two-step we see around these issues sometimes, and I think we'll talk about this maybe after the presentations, where workers are often assumed to have equal bargaining power even when they don't, but then assumed to have too much bargaining power as soon as they start to make gains. So in recent debates around what to do about inflation, a number of economists and policymakers have shown their hand here, suggesting we need to cool off the labor market because workers are getting too much power within it and therefore driving up wages too fast. So the assumption of equal bargaining power is used first to justify anti-worker outcomes until the assumption of excessive bargaining power is used to justify that same set of outcomes. The law does this kind of thing fairly often. In any event, the papers in this volume explore these issues from philosophical, legal, and economic perspectives. And they've been curated and developed to help shift the conversation around these issues, both at the level of policy design and within legal analysis. So I think I'll turn it over to the speakers. Let me just do very quick introductions. Larry Michel, of course, I think most people on the call will know Larry. He's the director of the Unequal Bargaining Power Initiative and former president of EPI. He joined EPI in 1987 as research director, and in his 3 decades at the organization, really helped build it into the nation's premier research organization focused on U.S. labor standards and living standards and labor markets. Suresh Naidu will speak second. He's a professor of economics and international and public affairs at Columbia University. He teaches economics, political economy, and development, and writes on various topics, including the economic history of slavery and labor institutions. He's also one of the nation's leading scholars on labor market monopsony. Angela Harris, finally, is Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of California, Davis, and co-editor-in-chief and founder of the Journal of Law and Political Economy. She's one of the most cited critical legal scholars in North America, and her work has been extremely influential within critical race theory, feminist legal theory, environmental studies, and more recently, law and political economy. Among other projects, she was a founder of the Water Justice Clinic at UC Davis, which is the only clinic in the US focused on providing clean water to disadvantaged communities. So Larry will start us off with an overview of the project. Suresh will then present his paper. Larry will present his own contribution. We'll have some commentary from Angela, and then some time for Q&A at the end. With that, why don't I turn it over to Larry? Well, Larry, I believe you're muted still.
Okay, old man disease, sorry. My job in my first presentation is just to articulate what the really flawed economics is that is embedded in employment law and how it disadvantages workers. I should mention that in order to even barely understand this, I relied on a kitchen cabinet of lawyers, Wilma Liebman, Cindy Eslin, Julia Tomasetti, Lynn Reinhart, and Sam Bagenstos, and Julia Simon Michel, plus some philosophers, Chetan Sethi and Liz Anderson, because we undertake this research to basically present empirical social science research that confronts the wrongful claims made in both philosophy and law about the role of employers and their power. The first thing that really shapes a lot of employment law is the at-will employment, which is rooted in what you can see on the screen, a lot of bad reasoning, which is basically that a worker's ability to quit is equal to an employer's ability to fire someone. If a worker can quit, then an employer has to be able to fire someone. It is assumed that a worker can find a comparable job as readily as an employer can find a comparable worker. This is deeply embedded in the law. I would imagine that around a family kitchen table, if people understood that this shaped employment law, they would be somewhere between horrified and laughing. But it is no laughing matter, actually. This is not something deep in the past, the so-called Lochner era. This is something right with us. In 2018, Justice Gorsuch, in the case that Brescian noted, in the very first sentence, basically says, should employees and employers be allowed to agree that any disputes between them will be resolved through one-on-one arbitration? This is the so-called freedom of contract framework. It basically is I would call Econ 101 silliness, that any transaction between consenting adults is optimal. And it totally abstracts from the reality of workers. Something that called out by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in her dissent, which I should add actually motivated the origination of this project, because she said you have to take into account unequal power, and we decided to do research that actually supported or just validated what she was saying. There's the assumption of equal power between employees and employers and the freedom of contract is embedded throughout employment law. I just show some of the areas here. Sam Bagenstos wrote a paper for the project that documents this. In the at will, which I just mentioned, basically creates hierarchy. It also makes it very hard to have any kind of anti-discrimination law that works, because as long as an employer can say, I have a reason why you were fired, and it's not because of sex, gender, union activity, they can basically almost always get away with what they were doing. As Brescian said about the gig workers, somehow we think that the workers have chosen their lack of rights. Forced arbitration was the Epic Systems. So it's there and throughout employment law, and it disadvantages workers. Now, economists, who I have a love-hate relationship with, though I am one, have basically, for many decades now, assumed that markets prevent exploitation, and that there's equal power presumptions in employment law. I have the citation here from Milton Friedman that I plagiarized, stole from Suresh's work, where he cites this. But basically, the idea is if you can quit, that keeps an employer from exploiting you. And more recently, Howard Schultz says, well, if you don't want to work for me, go somewhere else. That's your choice. You don't have to be exploited. But in the last 10 years, as Suresh will probably talk about, there's been a wave of research in economics where I think a large majority of at least center-left economists acknowledge the existence of pervasive employer power. But back in 2012, in a volume edited by Michael Wachter and Cindy Estlin, they relegated the idea of employer power to the specific case of like one employer towns. Okay, that's not really what it's about. We get people like Tyler Cowen criticizing Elizabeth Anderson, also saying, hey, there's not really employer power. So with that, I just say, in the slideshow, which we will post, you can see these supporting papers by Julia Tomasetti, Chetan Sethi, and Sam Bagenstos, where I get, you can see further these arguments. And here's other places to get the volume and read a blog. So thank you very much. And this will be over to Suresh.
Great. Let me share my slides. So thanks to Larry for bringing me into this project, and thanks Angela and all the JLPE crowd for publishing the paper. This was a lot of fun to write and kind of try to bring some of this academic literature, or at least my one take on the academic literature to a law and policy audience. This is joint work with Michael Carr, and I'll actually start off by describing the other papers that are in the volume before sort of talking about ours. And the overall thing, and Larry stole my thunder here by like taking my Milton Friedman quote, but I kind of really love this, that the idea is that the employee is protected from being coerced by the existence of other employers for whom he can work, and it's just like that's the assumption. and it's just that it's free to leave. That and it's a nice idea in theory. It's like the labor market looks like a gas. Everyone flows to the place where they're most naturally suited to work. But I think one of the things that sort of happened in the last, say, 10, 15 years is that the rise of like really granular data sets of like master worker firm data means that we can look at this kind of evidence of this and kind of look to try to see and quantify exactly how true is it. And it's probably somewhat true, but exactly how true is it? And so Catherine Edwards' paper in the volume kind of, and I encourage you all to look at it. It's kind of like going through the real like practical barriers that exist for workers looking for alternative jobs. So she runs through a number of labor market constraints. Basically, firstly, there's got to be other jobs available, and that's going to come back as we talk about tightness. There just needs to be a lot of jobs out there for you to find another job. But then even if there are jobs out there, your ability to search for them and how long it takes you to search for them, depends on you having free time, which you might not for all kinds of reasons because you've got a job is a big one, but also, or you might have kids or other obligations that just makes it hard to find for a job. But then even if you've got the time, a big chunk of your information about what jobs are there and also your aspirations about what kinds of jobs are good fits and things like that were also set by your social networks. And if those are like enormously segregated by class, race, gender, education, then you're going to wind up in a world where like people have very different abilities to find outside options. And I think the most fundamental thing is that jobs are these like high dimensional social long-term contracts where it's not just about the wage, it's how much do you get along with your boss, with your coworkers, how does the commute work with your housing, how does it relate to your kid's school? Like there's so many dimensions about a job that make a job a good fit for you and like kind of idiosyncratically for you. And so that means that like people are going to just have very different attachments to particular employers and particular jobs. And then another thing that Catherine, I think, also does a really good job on is talking about just the raw financial constraints and how like it takes money to be able to switch employers. So one is just like benefits mobility, right? So you might have a pension or a healthcare plan that you can't, it doesn't move with you. If you switch an employer, you also have to switch your healthcare. Is your same doctor in that network? All kinds of things about the way that the U.S. runs healthcare through employers means that it becomes hard to switch employers. And if you are even want to take a spell of unemployment in order to look for a job, because you might not have the money to sort of last a long time without a job, it means that you're kind of you quit your job and then you're kind of under real financial pressure to find a new job. And then similarly, if you want to sort of think about spatial mobility, like your ability to switch cities or switch neighborhoods in order to get proximate to a better labor market, that also costs money, and you've got to sort of think about the financial cost of moving. And all of these are combined with the fact that there's like pervasive credit constraints. So it's like basically it's harder to get a loan the less money you already have. Like you have to pay a higher interest rate if you can't put up collateral. And so that means that there's kind of always going to be this thing. If you have low income, it's going to be hard for you to finance all of these costs of moving. Okay. And I'm going to come back to the role of unemployment, but I want to sort of flag that like this is Larry's emphasis in his paper in the volume, and I think it's an important one, as Brishan put it in one earlier session like this. It's like unemployment is hard for legal scholars because there's no one to sue, but it's like a really important determinant of employer market power. And this is just completely ignored in all of the sort of both, in this Friedman assumption, but also kind of all of the legal theory around how labor market policy should work. And once you get that involuntary unemployment matters, then it means because we almost always have involuntary unemployment, that means we're almost always at a point where there is this asymmetry of power between employers and workers, and so there is like kind of just a pervasive asymmetry of power in the labor market. I mean, and even when the overall labor market is tight, you still will sort of find that there's subgroups of workers, minority workers, Black workers, workers without a college degree, who face persistently higher unemployment rates. And so that means that they're disadvantaged in the labor market, even when the overall labor market is tight. And I just want to point out that, like, actually, I think the last year has been like a remarkable period of really probably as close to zero true involuntary unemployment that we've sort of seen in the, and it's led to like a remarkable degree of wage compression at the bottom. So we're really seeing that relative to the middle of the wage distribution, low wage workers have made kind of very substantial, even real wage gains, even that's coming down now as inflation sort of stays high, but it was a real thing that happened in the last year and a half or so. I'll come back to this. This is just showing you that if you want to see what a really tight labor market looks like, look at World War II, where the unemployment rate is really, really low, but also the voluntary job-to-job transition rate, what's called quits, is really, really high. So when workers are just like able to walk out of a job, and there's plenty of other jobs there, that's kind of a really great metric of worker power, of worker market power, is when you can just kind of walk away from a job and there's plenty of other jobs for you to go to. And so we'll see like that, we've gotten close to quit rates, close to that, I think in recent periods, but World War II still I think takes the cake for tight labor markets. Okay, so what do we do in our paper? And somebody tell me if I'm going over time. I think I'm okay. But what we do in our paper is really sort of like go to actually something that's been looked at in labor economics for 50 plus years. It's called the quit elasticity, and it's a technical term, and I'll unpack it. But basically, what it is measuring is that measure of like voluntary quits, like your willingness to walk away for a job. How sensitive is that to the wage that your employer is paying you? So if an employer like changes the wage by 10% and then they lose, and then 30% of their workers immediately quit, that's like, there's some degree of mobility, but it's by no means 100%. So you can just think of like this number of like how sensitive is voluntary quitting to the wage that you're paid as a measure of how much power employers have. So if this number is really, really high, employers don't have a lot of power, because if they try to change wages or working conditions a little bit, everybody just leaves for the exits. Or you can also think if that number is really low, then employers can push wages down a lot and everyone just kind of stays. And so it's like a summary metric of the degree of employer power. And what we sort of show in this paper is that historically disadvantaged groups, periods of high unemployment, have even lower quit elasticities, and so that the employers kind of have more labor market power vis-a-vis these groups, vis-a-vis historically low wage groups, and in periods of high unemployment. This is just what one of these quit functions kind of looks like. It's like basically a downward sloping function. So as firms pay higher wages, people separate less, so the quitting rate is less. And so really low wage employers lose a lot more workers to quitting than high wage employers. And that's what this graph shows. And then this is showing the differences in this by groups. And importantly for this is kind of like even in low wage sectors, so things that you think of as like food services, retail, you see actually a very low quit or labor supply elasticity there, because, and part of what we're trying to show is that even in segments of the labor market that you might think are really high turnover, they are high turnover, but that turnover is not very sensitive to the wage. And so employers still have a substantial amount of market power, even in a high turnover, low wage labor market at the, like in fast food or retail. And similarly, we show that like in the period of the Great Recession, the quit elasticity is lower. And then for workers with very low wages, this first quartile, they also have very low quit elasticities. Okay, I'll skip this. This is also showing this by different demographic groups, and you can kind of see that Black workers have among some of the lowest quit elasticities in the data. So let me just finish by talking about the business cycle. So and coming back to the business cycle. So basically what's going on is what sometimes gets called the job ladder. So when there's very high unemployment, employers don't have to poach from each other. They can go to like the reserve army of the unemployed. And so that means that there's much less competition among employers for people, trying to poach each other's workers. And so that means for workers, there's like less opportunities to quit your current jobs, there's fewer transitions, and there's longer spells of unemployment between jobs. For employers, it means that they're able to fill a job vacancy more quickly. They have to spend less on recruiting. They can often like raise credentials because they know there's a pool of like credentialed workers out there. And what we sort of show in this paper, and we'd like more evidence on this, but it's that the quit elasticity is like pro-cyclical. So basically, like when the labor market is very tight, when unemployment is really low, this quit elasticity, the sensitivity of quits to the wage is very, very high. And so that makes a tight link between the degree of slack in the labor market and the amount of competition for workers. So, the overall point is that this degree of freedom of worker freedom of choice depends on the state of the macroeconomy. So who are you going to sue? And so I'll just end with this slide is that, you can think of the ideal type of the labor market as one where these quit elasticities are like literally infinity. And so that as soon as a worker tries to change their wage, everyone leaves. And this ensures that wages are equalized for the same type of worker across the economy. It's a longstanding assumption. Even Marx makes this assumption. But quitting a job is costly and hard most of the time. And because this is true, this ensures that employers have like a room and a reason to lower wages. And this degree of room that they have kind of depends on underemployment and unemployment, but it also, and we talk about this in the paper, it also winds up creating underemployment by keeping wages low. So that's it for me.
Okay, I guess
Larry.
I'm going to go again.
Yep.
Let me just add, if I may, that what Suresh and a lot of the research showed, translated into terms I like better, is that employer power is pervasive, obviously even more so with traditionally disadvantaged groups, and that employers are able to grab 15 to 20% of worker productivity for themselves, in addition to what they get from the productivity of their own capital. And that grabbing of productivity is even greater for Black workers, non-college educated workers. So this presentation is because the scoundrels in law fall back on no matter what, you're not allowed to mess with management. There's something really inviolate. If you constrain management rights, bad things will happen. And so this is pervasive. The paper by Julia Tomasetti in the volume documents this. And the courts just bring this in. I mean, this is nowhere in the Constitution. Like, right, Brishan and Angela, the lawyers here? Nowhere in the Constitution that says, capital has rights you can infringe upon. And the economics that says that if you restrict management prerogatives, think bad things will happen, I think it's probably never been true, but it's even less viable now, given a lot of the research I'm going to show you. Not only can you not mess with management, but if you do mess with management, there's court cases and Chamber of Commerce brief and First National Maintenance says it could be the end of free enterprise. So there we go. Now, to make any sense of talking about management rights, we need to identify what are the scope of management rights we're talking about, because the issues are about what happens in government regulation of labor standards and in collective bargaining. And in those realms, most of management's decisions are still left to management totally. What they produce, where they produce, what they charge, what their strategy is, the marketing, everything, the pricing, and all that is affected by collective bargaining and labor standards is probably somewhat about the level and structure of wages, criteria for promotions, discipline, and layoffs. So that's what we're really talking about. So we have 3 papers that really present social science evidence on areas of policy that constrain management, and each of them show that the world didn't end, economic performance didn't deteriorate. I think the prime one that should be accessible to everybody is that we've had bold minimum wage policies in the United States and in other countries for the last 25 years. We've had voluminous research on this, and this research shows that there's very little, if any, employment losses, hours for workers, even though you end up raising the minimum wage for as much as a third of earners in the United States. Hold on, I got to get the dog quiet. Okay, thank you, Bella. So, but the important part about the minimum wage is not only is there not the vaunted big employment losses, even for disadvantaged workers when you raise the minimum wage, but the fact is that the minimum wage raises wages. So when you take into account anything that happened to employment, and you also include the fact that the hourly wage rose a lot, the consensus finding is that if you raise the minimum wage by 10%, then the annual wage, the labor pool of all low-wage workers will rise by 9%. And we know why this happens, why the bad things don't happen, because employers can charge higher prices, they reduce turnover, they get higher productivity. So I think that's evidence number one. We can dramatically affect the wage structure and terrible things don't happen. There's another example in the debate about labor flexibility across countries. In 1994, the OECD published something called the Job Study, and it said that the labor flexibility is critical for economies to grow. And as a result, they recommended lowering minimum wages, decentralizing and weakening collective bargaining, weakening employment protections, and mostly in other countries where there's rights to, regulation of various ways about firing and layoffs. They wanted to reduce the generosity of early pensions, and a big favorite, reduce unemployment benefits in the levels and their duration. That was in 1994. Then there was, a response by researchers, and our friend Dean Baker and John Schmidt were major parts of that. By 2018, the OECD actually reversed itself based on the evidence, and other international organizations did as well. So they basically said the idea that labor flexibility is necessary for growth and that any violations of it are going to be terrible is not so true. And this in part happened because they realized that they had to focus also on equality and inclusion. And I just mentioned 2 other studies that came out since then, very sophisticated studies across countries that show that so-called employment legislation does not hurt workers. It actually increases labor share of income, increases labor force participation, etc. Okay, last. In that case of first maintenance, where the Supreme Court prevented a union from having rights to bargain over the subcontracting of work, the Chamber of Commerce and the court said you basically, you can't mess with managerial decisions. They need speed, flexibility, and secrecy, or else, they won't be able to. They'll lose productivity. It'll be terrible for the firm and the economy. There's a research paper in the volume by Jaeger, Noy, and Schaefer. That's about co-determination, which is in European countries, most notably in Scandinavia and Germany, where workers have shop floor co-determination. They get to have discuss things that are actually happening introductions of new technology and how they're done, etc. Jaeger, Noy, and Schaefer show that even with co-determination, there is no obstruction of decision making. It doesn't, and managers actually have a positive view of co-determination. So the assertions in First National Maintenance back in 1982, 83, whatever that was, was just ideology. And they looked at also the general impact of co-determination, which happens at the shop floor level, also at the level of workers being on the board of directors. And they say, basically, workers are helped. It's likely that there are positive impacts on firms and the economy. But the whole important point is you can do things to give workers power that allows them to benefit. And as I say, somehow free enterprise survives. These are the papers that I drew from. And again, here's the various sources. Let me say one thing, as we've impugned economists, at least I have, appropriately. I want to say that I consider myself an institutionalist, structuralist economist. My team in the economics field never believed that there was equal power. We were basically defeated in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s across from the right and the center left. The economists who advised Democrats abided by such assumptions as equal power. They weren't too worried about the distribution of power between employers and employees. And I'm glad to say that researchers like Suresh and others with sophisticated methods are reviving and validating that initial view. And with that, over to Angela.
Thanks, Larry, and thanks to all of you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I am one of the co-editors-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Political Economy, which is an online, open access, peer-reviewed journal. On behalf of the board and staff of the journal, I want to say how delighted we are to publish this special issue on the law, philosophy, and economics of worker power. The articles in this issue are an outstanding example of the kind of scholarship that we at the journal aspire to publish. And in my comments, I'm not a labor and employment lawyer, so instead I want to situate this volume in the context of the law and political economy framework. So the roots of this framework go back to 2007, just before the Great Recession, when a group of legal scholars interested in understanding the role of power in markets and economic activity began to hold workshops among ourselves and with heterodox economists. And that group, which continued and continues to meet annually as class crits, was influenced by other critical traditions in legal scholarship, such as feminist legal theory, critical legal studies, and critical race theory. By 2017, the Class Crits Working Group decided to found a journal, which became the Journal of Law and Political Economy, now affiliated with the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. And around the same time that we were developing the journal, a group of Yale law students and faculty began a blog called the Law and Political Economy blog, and with funding from the Hewlett Foundation began to put on their own conferences and workshops under the name of the LPE Project. So today, LPE is a transnational ecosystem of academic institutions and allied nonprofit organizations united by a common research program. Law and political economy scholars begin with the proposition that law, including legal institutions, legal actors, legal doctrine, and all the market and non-market activities that take place in the shadow of the law, is central to the creation and maintenance of structural inequalities in the state and in the market. LPE scholars also propose that economic and political institutions are interconnected with the systems of status, exploitation, and extraction based on race, gender, and other processes of social domination. So put more broadly and simply, LPE scholars are skeptical of the claim that economic activity is somehow inherently free of power until there's government intervention. We believe that economic activity, like any other human activity, is inherently political, full of power, and therefore vulnerable to structural and institutional inequality. So this special issue raises questions that are central to the LPE mission. In our editor's introduction to Volume 1, Issue 1 of our journal, Jay Varelis and I identified worker precarity as one of the key crises of our current historical moment. During the height of the pandemic, we saw dramatically how a vital sector of the labor force, the so-called essential workers, even while being hailed as heroes, faced a grim choice between going to work and risking illness and death, or staying home with mounting bills and the threat of hunger. Many of these workers were immigrants, some were undocumented, and they were also disproportionately non-white. In the early days of the COVID crisis, their lack of economic power contributed directly to their disproportionate representation among those dying of the new virus. That moment of crisis would not have unfolded as it did, however, were it not for a much longer history of legal, economic, and policy commitments to a remarkable fairy tale. The idea that workers and owners meet each other on a field of perfect equality of power, and that therefore the conditions under which people labor are freely chosen, maximally efficient, fair, and just. The articles in this special issue illustrate two complementary ways in which this happens. First, by shaping the rules of the game in property, contract, and business law to give employers tools with which they can systematically gain the upper hand over workers. And secondly, by perpetuating just so stories, such as the story of freedom of contract, or the story that the most efficient and just markets are the ones that restrict employers the least. These are stories that deny the reality of unequal power. So I'll end by noting that in addition to understanding how economic activity is described within law, economics, and philosophy as free and fair, despite serious problems of systematic inequality, another central goal of the law and political economy framework is understanding how to use law to challenge that inequality. So this is a particularly important moment of change that I hope we'll talk about in the Q&A. At the same time that we're witnessing the fissuring of the workplace, the rise of the gig economy, and new technologies that help employers establish private governments over their workers, we're also seeing a burst of new worker organizing in the workplace. From the fight for 15 to unionization efforts in workplaces like Starbucks and like Amazon, and the rise of worker cooperatives and small business formation, to the emergence of apps that help gig workers figure out how much money they're actually making, to the so-called Great Resignation, workers are rediscovering collective power. So it's my hope that the research and analysis presented in this special issue not only reveals the inequities in existing law and policy, but also will contribute to legal, organizing, and policy solutions that will improve worker health and resilience while building a more secure and prosperous life for all of us. So with that, back over to Brishan.
Thank you so much, everyone, for those fantastic presentations. I want to say a little, sort of step back and say a little bit about the role of the law here. And before I do so, I just want to remind those in the audience that we're taking questions from the audience. We have a Q&A button at the bottom of the webinar. So if you want to pose a question, please go ahead and do it that way. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call while I'm trying to do this. I fully endorse, everything that everyone has said. I guess what I'd add is that in some ways, the story of how the assumption of unequal bargaining power influences worker rights and inequality is even darker than it's been made out to be in the following couple ways. So the first is that, when Congress and state legislatures pass worker rights legislation, they typically do not assume equal bargaining power. So the preamble to the National Labor Relations Act makes this abundantly clear. The goal of the NLRA is to remedy unequal bargaining power by encouraging union organizing and collective bargaining. The Fair Labor Standards Act, the Federal Minimum Wage and Overtime Act, similarly tries to ensure that workers who don't have a lot of bargaining power don't fall below a certain threshold of wages that is closely linked to poverty and really deep exploitation. Okay. But then the problem is that within labor law, kind of the assumption of equal bargaining power that you see most apparently in the case law around employment at will ends up informing how judges interpret the set of statutes. So the whole sort of notion, Larry, you said before, managerial prerogatives aren't in the Constitution. That's right. Rights of contract and property are, and we have, had centuries-long battles on exactly what to do about that. But managerial prerogatives in part comes out of the classical common law and the assumption of equal bargaining power, sometimes defended on the grounds that workers essentially agree to, granting this type of authority to management, sometimes in different ways. But one great example in the labor law context is how unions are assumed to waive the right to strike in the course of a collective bargaining agreement as the trade-off for the employer's agreement to arbitrate. So, the parties are seen to have equal bargaining power in that context, but then it's often deployed in a way to undermine the amount of power that workers in reality have. Post-war labor law, I think, was in some sense a form of collective laissez-faire. That's the UK system, but in the US, we had elements of the same. The notion was as long as workers were collectively organized, they had equal power to management, but then that was used, again, to undermine many workers' rights to strike, rights to bargain over particular topics and the like. Okay, some branches of the common law of employment also refuse to assume equal bargaining power. So on its face, the law around non-compete clauses basically sort of pushes against enforcement of non-competes in many cases because of the restrictions on worker mobility that they entail. And workplace dignity and privacy protections at the statutory level and also through the common law very often recognize workers' vulnerability and forbid certain searches and certain forms of surveillance because of that vulnerability. Yet again, consent, workers' sort of free choice of the particular employment relationship can end up eroding so many of those protections. So if a worker endures a particular search and they, challenge it later on as violating their privacy rights, the fact that they consented to the search is a defense to the privacy claim. If workers agree to a non-compete through a similar process in Epic Systems, many courts will say they'll be bound to it even if they didn't negotiate it. The employer can sort of present it on a take it or leave it basis. So again, one part of the common law says workers need some additional protections, but then this assumption of unequal bargaining power just undermines that set of protections. And I mentioned at the outset, a version of this happens in employment status questions too. Is an Uber driver an employee or an independent contractor? If the worker in that context agrees to a contract that waives so many basic statutory protections, the courts take that into account in determining whether they actually, count as whether they're classified as an employee or a contractor. The one thing I would note here is I think the emphasis on equal bargaining power or, freedom of contract has grown more prominent in recent decades. And I think that's under the influence of neoliberalism, as one or two of you mentioned. Post-war labor law kind of assumed relatively equal bargaining power as long as workers were organized. And now the law assumes relatively equal bargaining power between individual employees and employers. And that's a substantial shift. In that sense, Gorsuch's position in Epic Systems is really a return to discredited Lochner-era theories, and the court is doing this in a number of different ways right now. And all these results, have come about because of really a decades-long effort by some business interests to roll back worker protections and empower managers and finance capital. So you see it, at all levels of all levels of labor and employment law at this point. You see ways in which the assumption of unequal bargaining power ends up being woven into the doctrine and eroding workers' protections. Okay, that's all the bad news. So here's the in some sense, the good news. I wanted to reflect on this for a moment. And here's my first question. It's for Suresh, and I of course invite Larry and Angela to weigh in as well. We're in a moment of a real upsurge in worker organizing, or at least it seems that we were maybe until a couple months ago. You're closer to the ground on the data on this than I am. But it seems to be happening both with workers organizing unions and workers who aren't seeking to unionize but are taking concerted action. We've seen organizing drives at Starbucks, at Amazon, at Apple that have been successful. The question is, how, if at all, is that upsurge related to tight labor markets right now? Do you think tight labor markets are contributing to it? If so, how? Does that cut differently in different sectors, et cetera? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that's like a really interesting question, but and partly because I think it maybe speaks to like why we're seeing these mobilization of Starbucks and not Dunkin' Donuts. Is that we're kind of seeing this organizing effort happening at like the top of the job ladder in the relevant sectors. And so the idea is that like, the model in my head is that when the labor market is really tight, the workers at Dunkin' Donuts try to get a job at Starbucks. But the workers at Starbucks are like, this is like the best job within the cafe sector that's there, and we want to stay and take advantage of the bargaining power to not exercise the option to exit, but actually sort of try to get some voice and some union wins here. Obviously, there's a whole lot of sociology and things around who's interested and how it's getting organized and all of that. But I think at the end of the day, like, you can get salts hired. You aren't worried about people getting fired for union activity because of the context of a tight labor market. And I think that's just kind of the really essential ingredient into what we're seeing. And so when people are sort of clamoring for a recession, they're also in some sense clamoring for decimating this kind of upsurge of interest in organizing that we've seen. That said, I don't have a crystal ball. Like, it could be that a recession just triggers that much more militant wave of activism, and who knows? But yeah, that's sort of some thoughts.
One important theme of my work and EPI's work is the role of public policy in determining wage suppression and inequality. And I think we need to step back a little bit about this, what's going on now, and recognize that a lot of it was determined by policy. In other words, there's a lot of discussion about how people are quitting and resigning. What they're doing is quitting, resigning, and taking other jobs. Why are they able to quit? Well, because there's a lot of job openings. Why were there a lot of job openings? Well, because the economy was stimulated by the American Rescue Plan of the Biden administration in the first few months of the administration. So it was policy that was intended and successful in getting a very rapid employment recovery, getting unemployment down very much, that led to the context that allows people to quit and give them more faith that they can exercise voice, fight on the job without fear of losing their job. I also think we're in a moment that isn't recognized, especially by the left for some reason, that, I lived through 4 decades of economic policy. Carter, Reagan, Bush, Obama, Clinton, Bush, all those people. And none of those, Democrat or Republican, did people really care about worker power, including the Democrats. We now have a policy agenda that this administration and a lot of people outside the administration are really insisting on. That's for class equity, it's for racial equity, it's for gender equity. And you start with the most important one, getting the unemployment rate down. Secondly, doing everything possible to promote collective bargaining, both at the NLRB, both rhetorically, through an administration task force on collective bargaining. What we really need is legislation, but that's blocked by the filibuster in the Senate. There's a broad, robust effort to raise labor standards, minimum wage, fight misclassification of workers into gig workers, overtime premiums, all these kinds of things, as well as a vibrant EEOC and other matters to deal with racial equity. So there's a full-fledged effort to strengthen workers. And, we're in such a hole, it's going to take many years, even if we were able to implement all these policies and pass the legislation to dig out of the hole. But the fact is, I think people should appreciate that, what's happening is very intentional, and we're going to be really sad if that gets lost by voters in the midterm in 2024.
If I can jump in and ask Brescian a question as the labor and employment lawyer on this panel. We were talking a little bit before we got started, before the recording began, about the state of the Supreme Court and recent Supreme Court decisions that really seem to be driven by a political agenda. And I guess my question is, how useful is labor and employment law? We've talked about this upsurge of energy for unionization, for new collective bargaining. Do we need better laws, or is it really about power in the end? Do we need to see workers engaging in some sort of general strike, or rediscovering some of the energies that were there when labor law was founded in the first place? How much do we need the court, I guess, is the question.
Turning the tables on me. I appreciate it. So, I think my answer anyway is we need both. We need an upsurge in worker organizing. We need an upsurge in citizen mobilization, driven not just toward protecting workers' rights, but also, restoring our democracy at this point, restoring voting rights, making sure that we can have a just transition. The energy for that is going to have to come in part from social movements, from unions, from other sorts of organizing. Now, the challenge is that the Supreme Court, as it's currently situated, and as it's currently acting, stands as a barrier to almost any progressive legislation one can imagine. A number of us have been talking about this sort of quietly for a while, and now people are starting to say it more openly. Amy Kapczynski just did an interview with Felicia Wallen on her new podcast discussing this issue. But between the way that the court has pushed back on administrative agencies' ability to engage in rulemaking around issues that aren't specifically authorized by Congress, number one, the carve-outs or the use of the extremely broad reading of the First Amendment that ends up allowing for corporate political speech to be essentially unregulated, that allows companies to escape general obligations on the basis of purported religious obligations or religious beliefs. The emphasis on a set of property rights that's really rooted in the 19th century in cases like Cedar Point, which is the California farm workers case from 2021. I think at this point, we can expect the court to push back on essentially any legislation that tries to rebalance power in the economy and within our polity. So we're going to just have to be fighting on both fronts for quite some time. I guess we get a question, switching gears here quite a bit, but I think one that's very much on my mind, and I expect is on a number of attendees' minds, and someone put it into the group chat. I'll put this to Suresh and then again ask, if the others want to weigh in. To what extent is inflation an effect of the Great Resignation, labor market tightness, whatever else is happening in the job market right now, versus other macro level factors? So supply chain issues, the war in Ukraine, rising energy prices, number two, versus monopolistic businesses simply feeling like they have a moment when they can raise prices and want to do so as long as it's possible in order to capture supersized profits. What's your analysis of that?
I'm in such an academic that I'm so loath to like speak out of my lane, but I will. On the first thing, they're just like, I think it's very, very hard to make any sort of link between the labor market tightness and the inflation. It's just like, it's not happening in the same sectors. It's just like, that said, what is going on? I think there is a role of ARP and there is a role of supply chains. And I think people are arguing about the extent to which there is like it's all the supply chains or it's all ARP. It's like, it's all the American Rescue Plan is like the right-wing position, I think, or at least the one that's a possibility of being true is that there's like we sent out a lot of checks and that's getting drawn down. And what you are seeing is a spike in corporate profits. That when you look at it, it's like labor share is falling and it looks like the profit share sort of is rising, but that's not evidence in either direction, because one of the reasons they're raising prices is because there's like consumers aren't fleeing them, so they're able to take back in profits because there's like money to be grabbed. At the same time, there are lots of supply shocks that are also there, and so I think we will not see the dust settle from this for at least a little while. And so I'm reluctant to speculate on the exact quantitative magnitudes of it, but I'm pretty confident the labor market tightness is not sort of a big part of it. I don't know, Larry or Angela, if you guys have different opinions.
I would just suggest, I agree with everything Suresh said, and I would just note that my colleagues at EPI, Heidi Sherholtz, Elise Gould, and most prominently Josh Bivens, write extensively on these issues, and you can check that out at epi.org or read their Twitter feed or whatever. So I don't think you can blame workers and their push for higher wages for the inflation. At the same time, what the centrist economists or people like Larry Summers are pushing, that wages are growing at a fast rate that is unsustainable if you identify that you want 2% inflation because we don't have enough productivity to pay for is not high enough. But the thing is, this is very asymmetric. For years we had inflation below 2%, and people seem to be pretty okay with living that way. If we have inflation over 2% for a while, that's fine. There's something remarkable going on around the world. Inflation is worldwide. It's an energy gas price thing. It's supply chain thing. It's even faster inflation in Europe at this point. So I think the danger is, which I think is the premise underlying the question, is that the Federal Reserve Board in policy is going to slow down the economy so as to raise unemployment, so as to slow wage growth. And we know who that's going to hurt. It's going to hurt low-wage, middle-wage workers. It's going to hurt Black workers, Hispanic workers, non-college educated workers the most. And so, I'm very hesitant to endorse, such policies.
Angela, we got a question from an attendee that I wanted to pose to you in the first instance, which is, I'll read the question, and there's a couple issues here. Attendee said, during austerity thinking, workers lost their good jobs and were forced to work for little money with poor employment standards. Do you see the climate emergency as a way to work toward a just transition with green union jobs? Or other type of good jobs? I guess more broadly, I would say, what are the opportunities that you see in this moment for new types of mobilizing to try to ensure better jobs with equity that fit into a just transition?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Again, with the caveat that I'm not a labor lawyer, nor am I an economist, so I can't speak to the sort of quantitative dimensions of to what extent that link is plausible or provable. What I can say is that from my conversations and involvement with folks who are doing climate justice work, and just transition work, there's a tremendous amount of energy and excitement and hunger to see an economy that is based not on fossil fuel extraction, but on renewable, sustainable forms of energy. And to link that question of finding ecologically sustainable work and energy with the question of justice for low-income workers in particular, but all workers more generally. There's a lot of activity in these among social movements to bring together questions of ecological sustainability, economic justice, and social justice, with the recognition that within the fossil fuel industry, for example, a lot of the burdens of oil and gas extraction fall heavily on Black and brown workers. If you think about Cancer Alley in Louisiana, for example, or in Northern California, where the Chevron in Richmond, California, is located in some very low-income neighborhoods. So the whole issue of environmental racism or environmental justice raises these questions of whether it's possible to transition to an economy that is simultaneously socially just, ecologically resilient or sustainable, and economically fair. And again, I'll defer to others who know the data to talk about to what extent that hope is founded by the evidence. But I will say again, in terms of my involvement with folks on the ground, especially in these highly disadvantaged frontline communities that are suffering environmental racism, there's a lot of energy and interest in organizing to promote all three of those goals.
I'd like to add, well, first I should say everything I know about climate change and policy I learned at the dinner table with my beloved wife. But I think this is an example of how policy in this administration is different than in prior Democratic administrations. For one, this is not about, you're not approaching it like, let's just raise the price of carbon. They're doing it with public investments to change the incentives to make sure that we have renewable energy. They adopted a plan that's spending, I don't know what, $370 billion. $60 billion of that is reserved for racial equity focused investments in energy and communities. There's a special attention to what kind of jobs are going to be created. It's not just throwing the money out there. I mean, the tax credits for electric batteries and all that, it has to be made in the United States. There's built-in labor standards. There's an issue, there's a focus on domestic jobs and good jobs. And I would say that, the experience on the Obama administration was that there was some good energy investments in the stimulus plan, but they didn't pay attention to jobs. And some of the learning from that was that you can do all these different things and you might just end up with more lousy jobs. But this group is really trying to do something different. And I think for that, and it's a substantial investment, and I think it can have a substantial impact. So I'm inspired. This is not going to solve all of the climate challenge. There's going to need to be much more done, but I think this is a great first step.
So coming back to the questions of unequal bargaining power a little more directly. For all the panelists, I've gotten a couple questions about this from the audience, and it's a question I had. What do you see as the most important policy interventions at baseline to try to remedy unequal bargaining power? So to what extent is it about encouraging collective bargaining? To what extent is it about trying to erode the importance of employment at will? To what extent is it about social programs like extended unemployment benefits or active labor market policies? To what extent is it about a UBI, right, or some sort of cognate policies that give workers resources regardless of labor market participation? There's a lot there. All those ideas are in circulation. I guess I'd be really interested to hear just which you see as the most important and why. I didn't do that in any order. Suresh, let me start with you.
Yeah,
Put you on the
Suresh, you go
spot.
first.
Okay, so it's kind of by any means necessary, so I think yes, but I guess I sort of think of it as like, what are the things that actually create their own political constituencies that can win the other stuff, and so that's why I'm kind of big on the collective bargaining over a lot of other. If you gave me my wish list, it's partly just because that's the one out of that list that sort of creates its own politics that can then kind of be a way of bootstrapping political coalitions to win the other stuff. And so that's kind of putting on my political economy hat. That would be the thing that's on the it's not so much addressing the power in the labor market. It's using a way to solve the power in the labor market as a trampoline to go win kind of a number of other policy fights.
Well, I would say most of that list would be on mine, but first and foremost, low and persistently low unemployment is the single largest thing, and we've emphasized that. Secondly, I don't think we have policies which are going to really make for a robust middle-class wage growth unless we revive collective bargaining. We're not going to revive collective bargaining unless we get some kind of legislation like the PRO Act, but I think we have to go beyond that into what is called sectoral bargaining. And I was disappointed that the penalties in the National Labor Relations Act that were in the Build Back Better were not included in the final bill. It's been, I urge all the reporters who are on this to suss out the story. Why did that happen? How did that happen? Because, people, many on this Zoom will know this, but in labor law, if an employer violates workers' rights, basically nothing happens. There's no real penalties. And there were, possibility of having some real penalties. Okay, so unemployment, real collective bargaining, high labor standards, a minimum wage that would really benefit the bottom 35% of the workforce is important and huge. And I think can be something that leads to the political economy that Suresh is going. So I'll just say that those would be my three: high labor standards, low unemployment, rebuild collective bargaining.
Yeah, I co-sign what my colleagues just said. And I think it's a really important point, too, that Suresh made about wanting reforms that enable other reforms to happen. The ball really gets rolling when people are conscious of the possibilities of collective action and feel empowered enough to start exploring them. And once you have sort of the minimum consciousness and critical mass of people saying, hey, we are getting the short end of the stick and there's something we can do about it, then the possibilities open up on a lot of other fronts to imagine new remedies.
Wanted to ask if any of the other panelists had questions you wanted to pose to one another. Larry, Angela, and Suresh.
Well, I'll just say one of the things that this is kind of to Larry, I guess, because you were doing the overview of the entire issue. One of the pieces in the issue, or a couple of the pieces in the issue that we haven't talked about so much, is the private government aspect. As you know, Elizabeth Anderson wrote a book called Private Government, and in which she argues that employers today really have the ability to to surveil, to monitor, to discipline workers in their behavior on and off the job. And that amounts to a kind of governmental power that really doesn't have any kind of check or balance. Maybe you could, do you want to say anything more about that?
I would love to. I would love to. Listen, Elizabeth Anderson's book, Private Government, should be read by all. It was part of I mean, there's really two inspirations for this project. One was Elizabeth Anderson's book, and the other was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's Dissent in Epic Systems, which of course everybody has read. But you know, one of the things I draw on from Elizabeth Anderson is that employer power also suppresses our freedoms. You know, the right talks a lot about freedom, but I think it's for us to say that you are not free if you can't determine whether you get to go to the bathroom on the job. You are not free if you can be fired for playing in a gay softball team outside of work, or for something you put on Facebook, or if you're riding your bicycle down the road and Trump goes by and you give him the finger, you could be fired for that. That's an employer suppression of free speech. You don't have free speech if an employer can make you go to a rally for any candidate, Trump or not. You know, you don't have power over your basic physical being. You know, one of the examples I cite was mentioned in the New York Times article by Peter Coy on the volume, is what happened when there was tornadoes in December 2020. There were two factories, one an Amazon warehouse, one a candle factory in Kentucky, where workers were scared of the tornado coming and killing them. They asked the employer to dismiss them, to let them go home. The employer said, if you leave, you will be fired. And what ended up happening is 7 or 8 workers in each place died from the tornado. Now, tell me it's easy to quit. If when you're faced with the possibility of death and you still don't quit, what kind of power do you have? So these are, you know, what Elizabeth Anderson's rhetoric, you know, calls employment, dictatorship. Pretty strong language. She says it's like under the Soviet Union when, you know, you get to move from Bulgaria to Romania, big deal. You know, you still face a totalitarian government. That's not something that economists talk about like that. So I really appreciated that. And one purpose of this volume was to reinforce what she said and to provide the social science research that validates what she's saying and that rebuts the kind of libertarian critiques, you know, that have been leveled against her. So I think it's very much, it's not only just equity, it's class equity, it's race equity, gender equity, it's freedom. And one more thing, it's also about democracy, because the squashing of unions, everything that's going on is about suppressing people's ability to have voice in policy and in their votes. So employer power has been used to suppress freedom, to suppress democracy, to create inequity, to suppress wages. And other than that, it's been a great thing.
Can I ask a question of Rishan and Angela, which is partly, you know, my it is maybe unfair, but I'm sort of curious about when I sort of said that who is there to sue. I was sort of curious, actually, like, what is the legal thinking about the Fed? And like, and is there in fact like something on the table where the Fed is this like very powerful actor created by statute? Why can't we sue the Fed? And just kind of curious about what thinking there is about, like, you know, holding the Fed to particular interpretations of the mandate, and particular interpretations of the Fed's mandate as like a tool for like macroeconomic sort of stability and things like that. And sort of just related to that, also just curious, you know, there's also been this like revival over in antitrust land in the neo-Brandesians, and also just sort of curious about curious how you see like the movements in the neo-Brandisian view as sort of like spilling over into labor law and of a common project, or kind of diverging because they also want to cover labor markets with antitrust.
Angela, do you want to take the first stab, or should I jump in?
Why don't you jump in? I mean, yeah, why don't you start?
Sure. So on the Fed, the short answer is I do not know. And I would point you to, I'd have to find the actual episode, but Sam Moyne at Yale Law School, a legal historian, has a legal theory podcast called Digging a Hole. And in one of the episodes, they actually talked about the lack of attention to the Fed among legal scholars. And the point that Sam made that really stuck with me is that legal scholars have focused on the Supreme Courts and the federal courts for a very long time, and there's long been a sense that the fact that the courts, the justices are unelected, and the courts can become unaccountable is a real problem for our democracy. While largely ignoring the fact that the Federal Reserve has many of the same characteristics and exercises direct influence over policy in a way the Supreme Court, doesn't necessarily, or sort of day-to-day influence over policy, I should say, in a way the Supreme Court does not. So there's not much scholarship on this. Bob Hockett at Cornell has written on it. A couple other people have written on it. On neo-Brandisians and labor law, I think that I think it's been in general, the renewed attention to antitrust has in general been a positive development for people who are worried about economic inequality and questions of structural power in the economy. In a couple of ways, it's just opened up that entire conversation. And I think there's broad recognition that workers' rights are a very important part of the structure power, and that the attention to antitrust has kind of brought people who weren't thinking about workplace rights to start thinking about workplace rights in a more systematic fashion. There is also I guess I would say, the recent actions at the FTC illustrate, some of the space for helpful collaboration here. Where the FTC is starting to, push back on non-competes and other forms of labor market collusion that can really undermine workers' bargaining power. There is, I feel like I always have to add in this context, a deep-seated tension that we have to keep in mind between the logic of antitrust and the logic of worker organizing, which is reflected in labor law. That unions are themselves, combinations in restraint of trade. And for that reason, we have exemptions to antitrust liability for worker organizing. I think it's just important not to push too far, and no one on this call is, but not to push too far in the direction of seeing labor market competition as the solution to what ails workers. Because in many cases, labor market competition is a large part of the problem. It's that workers end up competing with one another, right? So we want employers competing for workers more often, and we want workers being able to take wages out of competition. It depends. So rather than kind of appealing to competition as a general value, I think we have to think about where competition should be encouraged and where it often ought to be restricted.
Angela, you want to go?
I just wanted to jump in, and I love that question, why can't we sue the Fed? And the only thing I would add is that I think part of maybe part of the reason why we don't have a clear or a lot of literature in law on that is that a lot of legal scholars have taken up a more general cultural understanding, I think, which is the idea that economics is something that's technical. Economics is neutral and non-political, and so the Fed needs to be left alone to do its thing and handle that very complicated set of activities that we regular lay people can't understand. And so I think for a lot of folks, probably the ordinary person on the street doesn't know who the Fed is and what it does, but the assumption is, oh, they're doing some very complicated technical thing over there that I can't really understand, probably doesn't affect me in my daily life, and it doesn't have much of an impact on me as an ordinary person. And that's reflective, Elizabeth Pop Berman has a book called about the economic style of thinking, and there was just a symposium on the LPE blog about that, and very interesting conversation about the way in which both Democratic and Republican administrations have kind of adopted this notion that of pursuing efficiency is the job of economists, and economists need to be able to do their work quite separate from questions of politics, and that includes the ability to sue and be sued.
I'd like to ask Suresh a question. You'll like it, Suresh. It's okay. I'm gonna, so.
Go easy, man.
No. I want you to talk, because I think the audience would value hearing from you about the evolution of economic research over the last 10 years that has focused more on employer power. And in talking to you, you have, you're much more hopeful about the economics profession than I am. I probably carry too many scars from, over my career, but you've noted that people who went to grad school since the great financial crash of, 2007 and 9 are somewhat immune to some of the really ideological thinking that came before them and empirically oriented. So I think, I guess my question to you is, employer power is pervasive. Some of it, the economists like to talk mostly about, like non-competes or, too few employers. Some like to say it's much bigger, much broader than that, which I know you agree with. So maybe you just talk a little bit about how do you see the breadth and scope, depth of and trajectory of economics when it comes to addressing issues of employer power. See, that was an easy one, Suresh.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I will definitely say there's like a real weakening of the, the market will kind of do the right thing. And if we got rid of all these distortions, it would like do it even better. And so that, I think, particularly among people that study social policy, study the labor market, I think it's very, very hard to sustain that case just in the face of tons and tons of evidence. What's, I think, harder is the fields like macroeconomics, a little bit industrial organization, international trade, where it's like a very technical, much more of a priestly caste that's attached to a particular policy domain. And so you really need to like pitch an argument in their tools to get a hearing. And so I think that, if I had to describe the economics profession, it's technocratic in the sense of rule by technical methods. And the number one political priority is to make sure that economists are like seen as the holders of the right answer. But within that, the defense is that it is actually home to a lot more diversity of political opinion than has been true even when I was in graduate school. And so basically, if there's like young people that are interested in economics, like if you want to see kind of I'm involved in, I'll advertise this like core textbook project that's like kind of a new take on introductory economics that tries to highlight how economics is done at the research frontier rather than just kind of teaching you like supply and demand curves and oh look, everything looks like a deviation from just like market clearing. So I think there is parts of the change, but this is it's a discipline where people have tenure and then they take a long time to move on. And so it's going to be a while before I think we see change. And I also sort of have iron law of hegemony. If economics becomes more left-wing, it might just be that policymakers ignore it more. and that's my ultimate pessimism about like the role of the disciplines.
But in light of that, I have a history of speaking truth to power when it comes to both Republican and Democratic administrations. So when I say nice things about the Biden administration, don't think I'm just a sucker. But, Andrew mentions a book which highlights, the gravitational pull of economics, neoclassical economics, on all policy, that efficiency matters all and defer to economists. It's the same thinking that people say, why do we have a Council of Economic Advisors? And it's not really to advise how to get inclusive growth. It's about how to beat back bad ideas from all the departments, right? But I just want to say there's many things this administration are doing. They're not repealing the tariffs. They're not, doing all these different things that people are calling for that follow just a total neoclassical approach. They are doing Buy American. They're putting the thumb on the scale for workers in every which way. When they did the American Rescue Plan, that I think is responsible for the quitting and the low unemployment, they were attacked for doing too much. And this is the first time in my life that I saw an administration take risks on the side of workers. They said we'd rather do too much than too little. I have never seen that in my lifetime of observing policies from any administration, Republican or Democrat. So I think we're trying to overcome what happened that. And I think that, listen, the personnel in the administration, now, everything's not perfect. I could tweak things to be a bit better to my liking. But the personnel on industrial policy, on labor policy, on macro policy are of a different nature, and they're not, they don't abide by those old ground rules. And I'm thankful every day that, and I enjoy that. I would hate to see it go.
So we're right at time. I want to thank the panelists and everyone for being here, and of course thank the authors who aren't all here for writing such a fantastic set of articles. I'll applaud here. I have a couple just quick housekeeping things. A couple just questions in the chat I did want to make sure to answer. One was whether there will be a transcript or recording. I don't know about a transcript, but this will be up on YouTube, so people will be able to access it there, and I think hopefully a transcript from there. There is a question on the sources for some of the papers that Larry and others were referring to. Most of them are in the journal. It's in the journal issue itself that we've been talking about. The Journal of Law and Political Economy, which, as I understand, is open access. There's a link in the chat. If you just Google it, though, it'll come right up, and you can find the papers there. And then finally, there were a couple questions on more technical aspects of Suresh's paper. Apologies for not getting to those. I thought what I'd say is encourage people with the technical questions to get in touch with him directly on those. With that, I want to see if there are any final thoughts from the panelists. No.
I just want to close it out.
Go ahead.
So thank you, Grishan, Angela, Suresh. Thank you for all you do every day, actually, as well as doing this. Thanks to the EPI team that is really, really fun to work with and good. And I want to thank my friend Ira Arlick, who helped with the media dissemination, getting the New York Times article. But I want to advise people to go to not only the JLPE volume, but to all the other papers on the unequal bargaining power site, which is also you can find at EPI. And to follow EPI on Twitter and Facebook, sign up for their emails. It's the one, EPI set the standard over many, many years for, paying attention to the needs of workers, and that economic policy had to center the need of workers and workers' families, as well as low-income people. So, follow EPI, and then I'll just say, this is my last really thing doing as an EPI economist. I really appreciate the 35 years of the institution and all the people that supported us and all the people I collaborated with. And so a shout out to all of that. Thank you.